In the half-light of a Virginia courthouse, a surveyor lifts an old map from the wall, and finds another one pressed behind it. A map no living soul was meant to see. 400 acres with no owner. Only a single iron key drawn in careful ink. Within 7 days, 3 men who looked at it were dead. The map vanished. But the sin it guarded never did. The year is 1847, and the land itself is tired. Central Virginia's Piedmont hills roll like the backs of old men who have carried too much for too long. The soil is the color of dried blood after 2 generations of tobacco have sucked the life from it. Rain turns the red clay into rivers of rust that stain every wagon wheel and every boot. In the county seat, a place we will call Greystone for reasons that still matter to the families who live there, the air smells of wood smoke, wet leather, and the faint sweetness of curing leaf drifting from the barns beyond the courthouse square. Church bells ring at dusk from the white-clapboard Baptist meeting house, but the sound feels hollow, as though even the steeple knows some prayers go unanswered. This is not the Virginia of marble porticos and mint juleps you read about in polite histories. This is the Virginia that lives beneath the surface, a place of handshakes in backrooms, of boundaries drawn with whispers instead of ink, of debts paid in silence and power kept by men who understand that the law is only as strong as the men willing to forget it. Elias Corder stepped down from the stagecoach on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, dust clinging to the shoulders of his wool coat like a second skin. He was 41, compact, deliberate in every movement. His hands were scarred from years of holding chains and compasses, from driving stakes into ground that sometimes fought back. People who worked with him said he had the quiet of a man who had learned that the land remembers everything, even the things men try to bury. He carried no Bible in his pocket, but he carried the memory of one, his mother reading from Revelation by firelight, speaking of keys given and keys taken away, of doors that should never be opened. He had been hired by widow Dorothea Farwell to settle a fence-line quarrel that had festered for 3 generations. 230 acres of exhausted tobacco land abutting 3 neighbors, one of whom now claimed the eastern boundary had crept 40 rods too far west. Ordinary work. The kind of job a surveyor could finish in 10 days and still make the next stage to Richmond. But the land here had a way of making ordinary things complicated. Corder spent the first 2 days in the field with his chain and compass, boots sinking into the red clay, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves thick in his nostrils. The numbers refused to lie. According to the great framed map that hung in the county records room, the one every clerk pointed to with pride, the Farwell Eastern line followed a creek bed that had not moved in living memory. Yet Corder's own measurements placed that same creek 60 full rods farther east. 60 rods. Not a surveyor's slip. Not the slow creep of an old fence. A deliberate lie carved into the official record. He requested access to the records room, and Clerk Harwell Pute granted it with a smile that never touched his eyes. Pute was the kind of man who wore authority the way other men wore a well-cut coat, lightly, but sewn with invisible thread. 11 years in the clerk's chair. The previous clerk had left for Kentucky one night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a look in his eyes that suggested he had seen something he could not unsee. Pute kept his ledgers immaculate. His fingernails clean. His answers short. And when he looked at you, it was as though he were calculating exactly how much of your soul was already accounted for. The records room occupied the rear of the ground floor, a long chamber lit by tall windows that let in the morning sun like a blessing and then turned sullen by afternoon. The air was cool and dry, heavy with the scent of old vellum, iron-gall ink, and the faint must of mice that had lived and died between the pages of forgotten deeds. Tall shelves rose floor to ceiling, stuffed with plat books, tax rolls, and the administrative bones of 75 years of county life. And on the far wall, dominating everything, hung the great official map of Greystone County drawn in the confident hand of the early statehood surveys, its lines sharp, its boundaries absolute. It looked like truth itself. But truth, Corder was beginning to learn, has weight. On the afternoon of his second day, the light shifted. A cloud crossed the sun, or perhaps the angle of the afternoon simply changed. The map on the wall cast a shadow on the plaster behind it that was larger than the map itself. A faint, almost imperceptible difference. Most men would have dismissed it. Elias Corder did not. He waited until the clerk's young assistant, Pettis, had gone out to the well. Then he dragged a wooden chair across the pine floorboards, climbed up, and took hold of the heavy frame at both upper corners. The wood was thick, far thicker than necessary for a simple map. The kind of thickness that hides something. He lifted. The frame was not nailed to the wall. It rested on two iron hooks, held in place by its own considerable weight. It came down slowly, awkwardly, like lowering a coffin. Corder pressed it against his chest, feeling the dust of decades sift into his collar, the faint creak of old nails releasing their grip. When the frame finally lay flat on the long table, he turned it over with careful hands. Pressed between the official map's backing and a thin sheet of oilcloth nailed tight around the inner edges was another document. Folded 4 times with almost reverent precision. The paper was older, warmer in tone, the fibers still carrying the faint scent of the mill where it had been made decades earlier. Corder unfolded it across the table, smoothing the creases with the flat of his palms as though he were touching something sacred, or cursed. It was a map of the western quarter of the county, drawn in a hand more meticulous than the official version. The lines were finer, the notation smaller, the ink faded but still fierce. Most of the property lines matched the public record closely enough to fool a casual eye. But in the western reaches, where the land rose toward the first blue foothills of the Blue Ridge, the difference was unmistakable. 400 acres. Irregular, bounded on 3 sides by named creeks and on the 4th by a road that did not appear on any public map. Every other parcel on the hidden sheet bore a name, Farwell, or Grayson, or State Land, or Crown Grant. This one bore nothing. No owner. No deed reference. Only, at its exact center, a small, exquisitely rendered symbol, an iron key. Not a decorative flourish. Not a surveyor's mark for a locked gate. A real key, shank, bow, and bit drawn with the loving precision of a man who understood its meaning down to the bone. The kind of key that opens doors no one wants opened. Corder stood very still. The afternoon light had gone thin and golden, slanting across the table like a final warning. He could hear the slow tick of the courthouse clock in the next room, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to evening pasture, the soft rustle of papers settling on their shelves. But beneath all of it he felt something else, a pressure behind the eyes, the way the air feels before a storm that has not yet announced its name. The key stared up at him, black ink on old paper, and for one irrational moment he thought of the keys in the book of Revelation, keys to death and Hades. Keys given to men who were never meant to use them. He was still standing there when Harwell Pute entered the room. The clerk stopped in the doorway. His gaze moved from the official map lying face down on the floor, to the hidden map spread open on the table, to Elias Corder's steady, unblinking eyes. Something complicated passed across Pute's face, surprise, then calculation, then a careful, almost priestly stillness. "I see you've been thorough," Pute said quietly. "The frame was resting loose," Corder answered. His voice was calm. Surveyor's calm. The calm of a man who measures everything twice. "I noticed the depth." Pute stepped forward slowly, as though approaching a sleeping dog. He did not touch the hidden map. He simply looked at it, the way a man might look at an old wound he thought had closed. "These old buildings hold all manner of things between their walls," he said. "I expect the document has been there since before my time. Perhaps before my predecessors." A pause. "Do you know what the symbol means?" Corder met his eyes. "The key marking." Pute's gaze flickered, just once. "I do not," he said, and the lie was so clean, so short, it almost sounded like truth. Corder folded the hidden map with the same deliberate care he had used to unfold it. He placed it at the edge of the table. Then he opened his field journal and made a brief notation, not of the map's contents, but of the exact time, the quality of the light, the temperature of the room, the position of every ledger on the table. The kind of entry a careful man makes when he suspects he may one day be asked, under oath or under threat, exactly what he saw and when. That evening he walked back to the larger of the 2 taverns under a sky turning the color of old bruises. Lanterns swung from porch hooks. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. In his small upstairs room he sat at the writing table, candle flame trembling, and composed a letter to Solomon Traz, a colleague who had surveyed the western quarter 20 years earlier. He described the hidden map in exhaustive detail, the paper, the ink, the road that did not exist, the iron key. He asked, in the plainest language possible, whether Troz had ever encountered any off-the-record survey work in that sector. Work that might have been conducted outside the courthouse books. He sealed the letter with wax, pressed his ring into it, and left it beside his journal on the table, spine parallel to the edge, the way he always left it. Then he lay down fully clothed, boots still on, and slept the uneasy sleep of a man who has touched something that does not want to be touched. He woke just before dawn with the unshakable certainty that someone had been in the room. The journal had been rotated 3 degrees clockwise. Not enough for most men to notice. Enough for Elias Corder. The letter to Solomon Troz was gone. Not torn, not scattered. Simply removed. The faint circular impression of the wax seal still lingered on the wood where the letter had rested, like the ghost of a promise broken. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked down into the empty street. The first gray light touched the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, but the sound felt wrong, too late, too lonely. 3 men who had seen that second map would be dead within a week. The map itself would vanish from the county records before the month was out. And the 400 acres it guarded, the land with no name, marked only by an iron key, would remain, to this day, a place most people in Greystone County will not speak of aloud. But Elias Corder was only at the beginning. He would try to reach Solomon Troz again, weeks later, through a mutual colleague. What happened next is where the real story begins, and where the silence deepens. The silence that followed Elias Corder's discovery in the Greystone County courthouse was not empty. It was heavy, watchful, and deliberate. Solomon Troz, the old surveyor in Richmond whom Corder had trusted with his letter, answered only once. His reply was short, almost curt. He had received no correspondence from Corder, and he knew nothing of any unofficial survey work in the western quarter of Greystone County. The words were written in Troz's familiar hand, yet they carried the stiffness of a man choosing his sentences with extreme care. 4 months later, in the winter of 1848, Solomon Troz was dead. The official cause was listed simply as fever, one of the seasonal illnesses that swept through Richmond's crowded streets that year. He was 63 and had been in reasonably good health for a man of his age and profession. His widow later confided to a mutual colleague that 2 weeks before her husband fell ill, a stranger had come to their home. A man she had never seen before and never saw again. He arrived alone, spent nearly 2 hours closeted with Troz in the study, and left without taking refreshment. Afterward, her husband had grown unusually quiet, not the thoughtful silence of a surveyor studying his charts, but the heavy, burdened quiet of a man wrestling with a decision he could not share. He never spoke of the visitor again. The second death came faster. Obadiah Lacey was a hard-working farmer whose modest holdings lay in the western quarter, directly adjacent to the 400 nameless acres marked by the iron key. On that same fateful afternoon when Corder had lifted the framed map from the wall, Lacey had entered the records room on a routine matter concerning a road easement across his property. He had seen the hidden map spread open on the long table. How much of it he actually read is lost to history, but he had lingered long enough to notice the unusual sheet and the strange symbol at its center. In October of 1847, barely 3 weeks after Corder's discovery, Lacey was struck and killed by a wagon on the main road through town. 3 witnesses described the incident as a tragic accident. The driver was a man from out of county. He did not remain for the inquest and was never located again. The wagon rolled on, its wheels leaving deep ruts in the red clay, and Obadiah Lacey's body was carried home in silence. The third death was quieter still. Young Pettis, the clerk's assistant who had been sent to the well while Corder examined the frame, may or may not have glimpsed the hidden map. He returned to the records room to find Clerk Pute and the surveyor engaged in what he later described to a cousin as a very still kind of conversation, the kind where words are few and the air feels thick with things unsaid. In late November of 1847, Pettis fell ill and died within days. The county physician, Dr. Nathaniel Good, certified the cause as putrid fever. He had examined the young man only once, for less than an hour, and had not been called during any previous illness. No one questioned the certificate. In Greystone County, some questions were simply never asked. Elias Corder completed his original commission for widow Dorothea Farwell. His field measurements confirmed that the eastern boundary of her land lay exactly where her late husband's deed described it, not where the neighboring landowner had tried to push it. He submitted his report, collected his fee, and left Greystone County in early October of 1847 without ever filing an official note about the hidden map. He made no formal inquiry to Clerk Pute or any other county official. On the surface, he walked away clean. But inside, something had taken root. Over the next several years, in careful letters to a handful of trusted colleagues and in a series of private notebooks that his daughter would one day donate to a historical archive far from Virginia, Corder quietly assembled the fragments of a deeper truth. What he uncovered was not a simple case of land fraud or missing deeds. It was something far more calculated, far more chilling, a deliberate architecture of invisibility built by men who understood both the law and its hidden seams. The 400 acres marked only by the Iron Key were never empty. Travelers who passed near the western foothills sometimes spoke in low voices of smoke rising from chimneys that should not have been there, of distant voices carried on the night wind, of fields tended under moonlight by figures whose faces they could never quite make out. The land was worked. It was managed. Yet it appeared in no tax rolls, no census enumerations, no deed books, and no estate inventories filed with the county court. It was a place that officially did not exist, and that was precisely the point. To understand what Corder slowly pieced together, one must look beneath the polished surface of Antebellum, Virginia. This was a society that had perfected the art of parallel realities. Powerful families maintained two sets of books, one for the courthouse and the world, another for themselves. Official deeds, tax payments, and court records protected their visible wealth and status. But certain operations, those too sensitive, too profitable, or too morally complicated, were kept in a private architecture of letters, handshakes, and coded documents that never touched the public record. Virginia's gentry had inherited this tradition from the colonial period, when gentlemen's agreements often mattered more than royal charters. By the 1840s, it had become a refined instrument. Men who sat in the legislature, served on circuit courts, and filled the pews of prominent Episcopal churches knew exactly where the law could be bent, where the clerk would look the other way, and where questions were simply not expected. They were not lawbreakers in the crude sense. They were the law itself, and they knew its weaknesses better than anyone. The Iron Key symbol, Corder eventually discovered, was not unique to Greystone County. Oblique references to it appeared in private correspondence from at least two other central Virginia counties. Always connected to large, unusual land transactions where official records showed the parcel as unclaimed or state land, while private ledgers hinted at sustained, productive activity. One colleague in Lynchburg wrote to Corder in 1849 about a private survey he had been commissioned to perform, work never to be filed with any county clerk. The client paid double the usual rate in cash and insisted the finished plat be delivered directly to an address in Richmond. The parcel's location matched a section of unclaimed bottomland on the official maps. The man who hired him, the colleague wrote, was not the sort one asks questions of. He had the manner of someone accustomed to obedience without discussion. After the client left, the surveyor found a small folded paper that had slipped into the oilcloth case, a list of 7 initials arranged in a column, each paired with a number. He kept the paper and later sent it to Corder. Corder spent the better part of a winter matching those initials to names in deed books and legislative records. 6 of the 7 belonged to prominent men from 5 different central Virginia counties, men who held or had recently held public office, whose families appeared in the registers of Richmond's finest churches. The numbers, Corder concluded after careful study, represented proportional shares in a larger financial arrangement. He estimated the total value of the enterprise at somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, a staggering sum in the 1840s, enough to sustain a well-organized operation for many years. At first, Corder assumed the hidden map pointed to ordinary land theft, powerful families quietly claiming county land while shielding it from taxation. That alone would have been serious. But the truth that emerged from his notebooks was darker, more calculated, and deeply haunting in its moral weight. The 400 acres were not primarily about ownership. They were about management. In the plantation economy of the 1840s, enslaved men, women, and children were valuable property bought, sold, hired out, mortgaged, and used as collateral. The law both enabled and constrained these transactions. Probate, creditor claims, contested wills, and public inventories could expose human property to scrutiny that even the most powerful families preferred to avoid. When a patriarch died, enslaved people became part of the estate, listed in court records. When debts mounted, creditors could petition for their sale. When reputations in Richmond drawing rooms or Washington salons needed protecting, visibility became dangerous. Sometimes a transaction needed to happen quickly. Sometimes it needed to leave no trace that could ever be subpoenaed, examined, or used in litigation. And there was no clean, legal mechanism for it. That was the purpose of the land marked with the iron key. It functioned as an intermediary holding place, a territory that officially did not exist in any county record and therefore could not be investigated. A place where certain people could be moved, held, or transferred without ever appearing in a census, a tax roll, an estate inventory, or a death register. If they fell ill, no county physician would be officially summoned. If they died, no county register would record their passing. They existed in a legal void, rendered invisible not because the law ignored them, but because the men who controlled both the land and the law had carefully arranged for the law to look the other way. The families behind this arrangement were not obscure backwoods operators. Their names graced the state legislature, the circuit courts, and the membership rolls of Richmond's most respected congregations. Their public land holdings were extensive and meticulously documented. But this single 400-acre parcel had been surgically removed from the official record, maintained through a private system of coded instruments that circulated only among the initiated. The iron key was their mark. A simple image that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to those inside the circle. A symbol of access to a hidden door, one that opened onto a space where human beings could be held without legal existence, where souls could vanish from the sight of God and man alike. Corder's notebooks reveal a man haunted by what he had uncovered. He wrote of the land as a place of living shadows, where the cries of the afflicted went unrecorded and the sins of the powerful went unpunished by earthly courts. He referenced biblical passages on justice and hidden iniquity, on the blood that cries from the ground, and on keys that unlock not only doors but also judgment. He never returned to Greystone County. He never filed any official complaint. But in the quiet hours, by candlelight in distant rooms, he continued to gather fragments, connecting names, dates, and whispers across counties. The picture that formed was one of deliberate, institutionalized concealment, a machinery of silence designed to protect wealth, status, and reputation at the cost of rendering human lives legally non-existent. And yet the land itself was never truly silent. Even today, in the western quarter of what was once Greystone County, locals still speak in hushed tones of the key land. They tell of strange lights moving between the trees at night, of voices carried on the wind that sound like lamentation, of soil that seems to resist the plow as though it remembers too much. The map has long since vanished from the courthouse records. The iron key symbol appears in no public document. But the legacy remains. A spiritual weight. A haunting reminder that some sins are not erased by careful bookkeeping or private agreements. They are written instead in the red clay of Virginia's hills, in the unmarked graves that no census ever counted, and in the collective memory of a county that learned long ago to look away when certain questions were asked. Elias Corder lived out his remaining years in another part of the state. He surveyed land for honest men and kept his own counsel. But in his final letters to his daughter, he spoke of the iron key not as a surveyor's mark, but as something far older, a symbol of locked truths that God himself may one day turn. The question that lingers, even now, is this. If a place can be made legally invisible, what else can be hidden there? And how long can the blood that cries from the ground be silenced before divine justice demands an accounting? The law, Elias Corder noted in his private notebooks with the precision of a surveyor marking a boundary, does not always need to be broken. Sometimes it is simply never given the occasion to look. What he had stumbled upon in Greystone County was not an isolated sin, but an extreme and tightly orchestrated version of practices that threaded through much of the Antebellum South. Families of standing maintained visible plantations with public deeds and tax records, while quietly sustaining shadow holdings, places managed through private agreements, coded ledgers, and gentlemen's understandings that never touched the courthouse books. What made the Greystone arrangement remarkable was its scale, its coordination among multiple prominent families, and the ruthless efficiency with which it defended itself when threatened. The threat came in the unlikely form of a circuit-riding Methodist preacher named Josiah Drummond. Drummond was 44 years old in the spring of 1851, a plain-spoken man of sincere but uncomplicated faith. For 15 years he had traveled the red clay roads and pine shadow trails of the Virginia Piedmont, preaching in isolated farmhouses, under brush arbors, and in small whitewashed meeting houses where the air smelled of damp wool and wood smoke. He had grown up in western North Carolina as the son of a mill owner, given enough schooling to read his Bible fluently and enough moral formation to believe that a Christian man carried certain obligations even when the world made them inconvenient. He was not an abolitionist firebrand. He did not thunder against the institution of slavery from any pulpit. He baptized the infants of enslaved mothers when invited, spoke graveside words over the dead when permitted, and otherwise moved carefully within the social architecture of the communities he served. Most ministers in his position learned the same quiet accommodation. Drummond was no different until a Tuesday morning in May 1851. He had taken what a local farmer assured him was a reliable shortcut between 2 points on his regular circuit. The path wound through a partially cleared stretch of woodland in the western quarter of Greystone County, where the land began its slow rise toward the Blue Ridge foothills. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and turned earth. Birds called from the canopy, but their songs seemed strangely muted. At the edge of a small clearing, Drummond reined in his horse. Before him stood a cluster of rough structures, more lean-tos and sheds than proper cabins, along with a modest garden plot, a hand-dug well, and perhaps 30 people engaged in the quiet labor of daily survival. Some tended rows of beans and corn. Others carried water in wooden buckets. A few children played listlessly in the shade of the largest shelter. Most were younger adults, with a handful of older men and women whose faces carried the deep lines of long endurance. None of them startled at the sight of a white man on horseback. Instead, they regarded him with what Drummond would later describe in his journal as exhausted caution, the guarded look of people who had learned that surprise was a luxury they could no longer afford. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the soft red clay. "I am Josiah Drummond," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "a minister of the Methodist persuasion, traveling my circuit. Have you received any ministry here of late?" For a long moment, no one spoke. Then an older woman stepped forward with deliberate, measured steps. She appeared to be around 60, her face a map of intelligence sharpened by decades of reading the intentions of strangers in an instant. Her hands were calloused, her posture straight despite obvious weariness. She answered carefully. "They had prayer among themselves," she said. "Some among them knew the scriptures well enough to lead. They managed as best they could when left to their own resources." She spoke without bitterness, without plea, simply as one stating the facts of their existence. Drummond asked where they were. The question seemed to confuse her. When he clarified, she replied that this was Virginia. There were trees, and water, and a road at the far edge where people sometimes passed. These were the coordinates that mattered in her world. She did not offer the name of any owner, any estate, or any county official responsible for them. Because, as Drummond slowly realized, she could not. He stayed perhaps half an hour. He prayed with them, shared what little he carried in his saddlebags, some hardtack, a few needles and thread, a small packet of salt, and offered what spiritual comfort he could. Then he mounted and continued on his way, the image of that clearing burning behind his eyes. In the days that followed, the scene haunted him. Not the presence of enslaved people working land that was the ordinary fabric of life in the Piedmont. What disturbed him was the absence, no overseer, no visible master, no connection to any named plantation. These 30 souls existed in an administrative void. No one was officially responsible for them, which meant no one was officially accountable if harm came to them. He wrote a careful letter to the Methodist Conference in Richmond, describing what he had seen without speculation about its legality, and asked if any missionary or charitable work was being conducted in that sector. The reply was polite, reassuring, and empty. No such work was known, and the people were surely properly situated on legally held property. He wrote again, this time to a state legislator known for at least nominal concern about the treatment of enslaved people, framed in terms of preventing social disorder. The letter was returned unopened with a note that the gentleman was traveling. A third letter to a Richmond newspaper was never published. In June of 1851, Drummond's presiding elder, Augustus Fell, summoned him to Charlottesville. With visible discomfort, Fell informed him that his circuit assignment was being changed immediately. He would be transferred to a remote circuit in the far southwest of Virginia, near the Kentucky border. The request had come from several prominent members of the conference who had concerns about Drummond's conduct. No further explanation was given. Drummond obeyed. He had spent his life honoring the structures of authority placed over him. But before he left the Piedmont, he made one final visit to the western quarter. The clearing was empty. The rough structures still stood, but they had been stripped bare. The garden plot had been freshly turned under. The well was covered with heavy planks. Every trace of human life had been removed with chilling speed and thoroughness. In his personal journal, later preserved by his family and donated to a Methodist archive, Drummond wrote, "The speed with which the place was emptied disturbed me more than anything I had witnessed. It required foreknowledge. Someone knew I had written those letters before any reply could possibly have reached them. The only explanation is that one who received my communications informed the relevant parties, and they acted with an efficiency that suggests they had long prepared for exactly this moment." He added, after a pause, "I have no power in this matter. I do not know that any power available to me would be sufficient. I write this so that the fact of what I witnessed will survive, should the day ever come when merely surviving is enough. This is the part of the story where one might expect an investigation, a reckoning, a moment when the machinery of justice begins to turn. But in Virginia in 1851, power did not always investigate. Sometimes it simply ensured that no investigation could ever begin. The man who would eventually connect every thread, the hidden map, the iron key symbol, the parallel record-keeping system, and the ghostly clearing in the western woods, was not Elias Corder, though Corder had come closest. It was a younger man named Festus Albright. Albright was 28 in 1854 when he returned to Greystone County to settle his deceased mother's estate. He had grown up in the county, left for Richmond at 18 to study law, and now worked as a clerk in a respected Richmond firm. His mother had been the widow of a man who had served in an unofficial capacity in the county records office during the years before Harwell Pute took the clerk's chair. He handled overflow work, copying documents, organizing ledgers, and witnessing transactions that never quite made it into the official books. In a small wooden box kept in her bedroom, Albright found a collection of his father's private papers, notes, drafts, fragments of correspondence never meant for public eyes. Among them was a letter dated 1834, 13 years before Corder's discovery. It was addressed to Albright's father and written by a man named Renwick Holloway. The letter was careful, but not careful enough. Holloway had been a land agent working for a consortium of Central Virginia families in the 1820s and 1830s. He was, in essence, the architect of the parallel system, the man who had designed how the 400 acres, and similar parcels in neighboring counties, could be kept entirely out of the official record while remaining fully operational as managed holdings. The letter was his insurance policy. Holloway had grown to distrust the powerful men he served. He feared that if the arrangement ever faced scrutiny, the families would sacrifice him without hesitation. He was not of their social standing. He had no political protection. His signature would be the one left on documents while their hands remained clean. So he had hidden the original map behind the framed county plat in the courthouse records room. He had also made copies of key documents, the private survey plat, the coded deed instruments, the financial ledgers detailing contributions and shares, and placed them with a small number of trusted intermediaries, including Albright's father. He had done this not to expose the scheme immediately, but as a deterrent. The families knew the evidence existed in other hands. As long as destroying Holloway would not destroy the proof, they had reason to keep him alive. It had worked for a time. Holloway died in 1839 at the age of 51, officially of inflammation of the lungs. Whether his death was natural or quietly assisted remains a question the surviving record cannot answer. But the letter Festus Albright now held in his mother's quiet bedroom was devastating in its specificity. It named the families involved. It listed their respective financial stakes in the arrangement. It detailed the amounts paid, the years of contribution, and the precise mechanics of the private instruments that kept the 400 acres legally invisible. It described how the iron key symbol was used to mark all documents belonging to the shadow system, an innocuous image that served as both password and warning among the initiated. Albright sat for a long time with the letter in his hands, the afternoon light slanting through the small window and pooling on the pine floorboards like spilled honey. Outside, the familiar sounds of Greystone County drifted in distant wagon wheels. The lowing of cattle, the call of a mockingbird. But inside that room, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of secrets that had already claimed lives. He understood now why 3 men had died so quickly after Corder lifted the map from the wall. He understood why a preacher's letters had triggered the overnight disappearance of 30 souls. He understood why the land marked with the iron key had no name in any official record. It was a place where human beings could be held in a legal void, worked, moved, hidden, or disposed of without ever appearing in a census, a tax roll, a probate inventory, or a death register. A place designed so the law would have no occasion to look. A spiritual darkness made visible only by accident, and then swiftly erased. Festus Albright faced a choice that would haunt the rest of his life. He could destroy the letter and walk away, preserving his own safety in the fragile peace of his return to Greystone County. Or he could begin to turn the iron key. And once turned, some doors do not close again. The question that still echoes across the red hills of central Virginia is not whether the arrangement existed. The fragments left by Corder, Drummond, and Albright make that clear. The deeper question is this: how many other clearings, how many other invisible holdings, how many other iron keys still lie hidden beneath the polite surface of history, waiting for the day when the blood that cries from the ground finally demands to be heard? And what kind of justice can reach a sin that the law itself was carefully designed never to see? Festus Albright sat alone in his mother's small bedroom as afternoon light faded into the long shadows of a Virginia evening. The letter from Renwick Holloway lay open on the wooden table before him, its ink still sharp after 20 years. Every line carried the weight of calculated risk. Holloway had not written in vague generalities. He named the families. He listed their financial contributions year by year. He detailed the private instruments, the deeds that were never filed, the surveys that were never recorded, the coded letters that circulated only among the chosen. Each family held fragments of the evidence. No single man possessed enough to destroy the others. It was a web of mutual protection, elegant in its cruelty. And then Holloway explained the true purpose of the 400 acres marked only by the iron key. It was never meant to be a permanent plantation. It was a way station. A managed shadow space where enslaved men, women, and children could be held during transitions that the families preferred to keep invisible. People being sold in ways that violated earlier contracts. Individuals whose presence on any named estate would trigger probate complications, creditor claims, contested wills, or public inventories that might draw unwanted attention. People whose legal status had become inconvenient, listed as collateral on debts, entangled in old provisions that had never been fully honored, or simply too visible at the wrong moment. On the 400 acres, none of those risks existed. Because the land itself did not legally exist. Transactions could be completed in the space between official happenings. People could move through it without ever appearing in any record. No census taker would count them. No county physician would treat them. No death register would mark their passing. They existed in a void deliberately carved out of the law's sight, a place where things happened between the things the world was allowed to see. Albright, trained as a lawyer's clerk, understood the document's lethal value. He also understood, with the clear-eyed knowledge of a man who had grown up in Greystone County and returned as an adult, exactly how far the named families would go to protect themselves. The distance between his own modest position and their entrenched power was vast. He did not rush to the courthouse. He did not write to Richmond newspapers. He had heard what became of Josiah Drummond's letters 3 years earlier. Instead, he copied Holloway's letter 3 times in his own careful hand. He sent each copy to a trusted contact in 3 separate cities, with strict instructions. The packets were not to be opened or acted upon unless Albright himself failed to make contact within 60 days. Only then were they to be delivered to journalists and legal authorities. With his own safety provisioned as well as he could manage, Festus Albright walked to the courthouse to meet Harwell Pute. No direct record of that meeting survives, but its outcome can be read clearly in the silence that followed. Within 2 weeks, the boundary dispute tied to his mother's estate was resolved entirely in Albright's favor, without litigation, without public disagreement, through a quiet agreement among all parties. Within a month, Albright had left Greystone County and returned to Richmond, where he accepted a position with a law firm that maintained no connections to the prominent families of his home county. He never spoke publicly of what he had found. He never filed any legal action. He never released the insurance copies beyond the 3 men who held them. But he kept his own copy. And when Festus Albright died in 1891 at the age of 65, his papers, including Holloway's original letter, his handwritten copies, and a brief, guarded account of his meeting with Clerk Pute, passed to his daughter. She was a woman of sharp intelligence and little tolerance for the convenient arrangements of powerful men. In 1893, she carried the documents to a journalist in Philadelphia, far enough from Virginia that the family's reach had weakened, and several of the principal figures named in the letter were already dead. The journalist, Harriet Copeland Marsh, one of the few women working at a major newspaper in that era, published the story in 3 careful installments. It named the families. It reproduced substantial portions of Holloway's letter. It laid bare the architecture of the invisible 400 acres. The response in Virginia was predictable and well-rehearsed: public denials, a handful of heated letters to other papers, and then a thick, deliberate silence that settled over the matter like red clay after rain. No prosecutions followed. No legal actions were taken. The families, or their surviving descendants, issued no statements. The story faded into the kind of historical forgetting that powerful networks have always mastered. And the hidden map itself, the one Elias Corder had lifted from behind the courthouse frame in 1847, never resurfaced. When the county records room was reorganized in the 1880s and its contents moved to a newer facility, the great official map was catalogued and relocated. The heavy frame was discarded. Whether the second map had been removed years earlier by Pute, by someone acting on the family's instructions, or by another hand in the decades between Corder's visit and the reorganization, no one could say. It was simply gone. If this story has begun to settle under your skin, if you feel the weight of how easily truth can be buried, hit that like button now. Share this video with someone who understands that the darkest histories are the ones written in silence. And subscribe to Liturgy of Fear with notifications on, because we are not finished yet. The 400 acres in the western quarter were eventually absorbed into neighboring properties in the chaotic years after the Civil War. The legal mechanisms were characteristically murky, a mix of adverse possession claims, Reconstruction-era state land grants, and the kind of quiet transactions that occur when no one with the power to object is in a position to know they should. By the 1880s, a man walking that land would have found almost nothing to suggest its past. The rough structures Josiah Drummond had seen in 1851 had collapsed or been dismantled. The well was filled in. The garden plot had surrendered to scrub and then to second-growth timber, young oaks and hickories reaching toward the light where the soil was thinnest and reddest. The same exhausted Piedmont earth that had fed tobacco for generations now grew only quiet forest once more. Elias Corder died in 1879 in another state, far from Greystone County. He never returned. He never published his findings. His private notebooks, eventually donated by his daughter to a distant historical archive, remain the most detailed surviving account. Written in the same meticulous hand he used for field surveys, they speculate only where evidence allows. Near the end of the final notebook, Corder set down a single paragraph that still chills those who read it. I have been asked what I believe happened to those people, the ones on the land that existed in no record. I do not know. I have no way of knowing. That is the cruelest part of the arrangement. Not merely that they were held there, but that the system was designed so no one would ever have cause to look for them. You cannot investigate a disappearance that was never officially acknowledged. You cannot account for lives that were never counted in the first place. He wrote nothing more on the subject. Harriet Copeland Marsh pursued the story for 2 more years after her 1893 articles. She searched for any surviving testimony from those who had been held on the 400 acres or had passed through it. She found fragments only, oblique oral histories in local families referring to the land in the western quarter that people didn't go near and didn't discuss. An elderly man told her his grandfather once said the worst thing about certain secrets was not that they were hidden, but that hiding them required the cooperation of so many people, and that once given, such cooperation was almost impossible to withdraw. Her follow-up articles were never published. She left the newspaper in 1895. Colleagues called it personal reasons. In a private letter, she attributed it to visits her editor had received from men connected, in ways I could not fully trace, to the Virginia interests I had been writing about. She kept her research notes. They passed through her family and were donated to a university archive in the 1960s, where they sit today in a collection visited by perhaps a dozen researchers each year. The hidden map was never recovered. In the county once known here as Greystone, a county that still exists, with its courthouse, its records room lined with deed books, and its quiet hills, there is no official acknowledgement of any of this. No plaque. No historical marker. No mention in published county histories. The land in the western quarter has changed hands several times. It is now divided among private owners, none of whom appear to know what the soil beneath their feet once held. Some descendants of the families named in Holloway's letter still live in the region. Whether they know the full story of what their ancestors built and maintained is a question history has not been permitted to answer. What the surviving fragments reveal, Corder's notebooks, Holloway's letter, Drummond's journal, Albright's guarded account, and Marsh's research, is the extraordinary effort required to excise 400 acres and the people on them from every official record. The network of prominent men needed to sustain that excision across decades. The quiet deaths, reassignments, suppressed letters, and erased clearings that occurred whenever the arrangement threatened to surface. At the center of it all remained the symbol on the hidden map, the iron key. A simple drawing that meant, this door opens only from the inside, and only for those who already hold the key. This place belongs to a different system of accounting, one that runs parallel to the law, never touching it, never visible to anyone who does not already know where to look. Elias Corder looked. He pulled the framed map from the wall and found another map behind it. He saw the roads that were never built, the property lines that appeared in no deed book, and the 400 nameless acres marked only by that single iron key. He understood enough to spend the rest of his life quietly documenting what he could. He understood too little to bring it fully into the light. That is the nature of certain hidden histories. The people who discover them are rarely positioned to expose them completely. And the people who created them counted on exactly that, carefully, skillfully, from the very beginning. Somewhere in the hills of central Virginia, that land still exists. The trees are different now. The structures are gone. The well is filled. But the boundaries remain, the same watercourses, the same slow rise toward the distant Blue Ridge that the people who once lived there could see from the edge of the clearing. They left no record. That was the entire point. Yet we know, in the fragmentary and always insufficient way that history ever knows anything, that they were there. This story is more than one hidden map, one surveyor, or one county in Virginia. It is a mirror held up to how deliberately, how skillfully, certain truths can be buried, not by accident or the passage of time, but by men who understood exactly what they were doing and possessed every resource needed to do it well. The iron key was never meant to be found. But it was. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. What do you think happened to the souls who passed through that invisible place? Do you believe the full truth was ever told, or do you suspect there are still other iron keys buried beneath those red Virginia hills, waiting for someone else to notice a frame that is thicker than it should be? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. If stories that pull back the veil on America's hidden corners move you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who isn't afraid of the dark. The land remembers. Perhaps, one day, we will remember enough.